She poured sand inside her walls and made a home. Elias Rourke, who had led freight teams across the prairie before the railroad, told her, "Bank on that, widow, and they will find you and the boy stiff before thaw." She had $29, a 6-year-old son, and needed 6 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12th, 1884, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours. But 3 months earlier, Marit Vangen had never built a wall in her life. She had arrived in Kingsbury County in August of 1883 with a husband who could swing an axe and a boy who could carry water. By October, she had neither advantage. The wagon that killed old Vangen had not even been his own. He had borrowed it to haul lumber from De Smet, and the team had spooked at a snake in the grass, and the whole rig had gone over sideways into a washout with Ole underneath the bed planks. He lived 3 days with crushed ribs and blood in his lungs. Then he stopped. Marit had been 27 years old for exactly 1 week when she buried him in ground that was already starting to harden. The claim was in her name now. 160 acres of treeless grass under the Homestead Act, with a residence requirement she could not abandon and an improvement obligation she could not meet. The law did not care that her husband was dead. The law wanted 5 years of continuous habitation and visible cultivation. Walk away, and the filing went back to the land office. Walk away, and every board Ole had hauled, every nail he had driven, every hour they had spent proving up became nothing. She could not walk away. The cabin stood 12 feet by 14 feet, single room with a lean-to corner that Ole had framed for a summer kitchen. The walls were single-thickness planking, milled boards nailed to a post frame with no sheathing underneath. When the wind blew from the northwest, the cracks between boards showed daylight. When the temperature dropped, frost crept across the inside face of those walls like something alive and looking for purchase. Marit had $29 in paper currency hidden in a tin behind the stove. She had a 6-year-old son named Ivor, whose chest rattled when he breathed at night. She had a borrowed team gone back to its owner because she could not afford to feed horses through winter. She had a debt at Door's lumberyard in De Smet for boards delivered but not yet paid. And she had less than 3 weeks of cut firewood stacked against the cabin's east wall. 3 weeks. If she fed the stove all day and all night, which she would have to do when the cold came in earnest, 3 weeks of fuel. Maybe 4 if she rationed hard and let the room get cold while she slept. The cold did not care about rationing. The cold would come in January and February like something that meant to kill her, and it would not ask permission. 17 miles to De Smet. In summer, a hard day's walk. In winter, with drifts, with wind, with a child who could not keep up, impossible. She could not haul fuel on foot. She could not afford to hire a team. She could not borrow because everyone who might lend was watching their own stack shrink. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. She needed 6 cords minimum to get through the winter with a fire burning day and night. She had perhaps 2. Cutting more was work for a man with a team to drag logs and time to split them. She had no team. She had no logs. She had a hatchet and a bucksaw and hands that were already cracked from hauling water. Ivor coughed in his sleep. The sound came from the lean-to corner where his cot was wedged against the wall. A wet, clinging cough that had started in September and never quite left. On warm nights it was nothing. On cold nights it worsened. By January it could become pneumonia. By February it could become a second grave beside his father's. Marit did not sleep well anymore. She lay on the narrow bed that had been wide enough for 2 and listened to her son's breathing and felt the cold creeping through the wall behind her head. The frost on the inside of the boards was her enemy. She could see it there in the moonlight, crystalline and patient. Every night the room fought the outside and lost a little more ground. Elias Rourke came on the 3rd day after the burial. He rode a gray gelding that looked as tired as he did, and he sat in the saddle for a long moment, looking at the cabin before he swung down. Marit watched him from the doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set. She knew Rourke by reputation. 8 winters on the prairie, former captain of a freight team that had run supplies between Yankton and the northern settlements before the rail came through. He had buried a wife and a daughter to the cold, the wife in the blizzard of '79, the daughter to pneumonia 2 years later. He was the man people consulted when they wanted to know if a claim was survivable. He was the man who told hard truths and expected no argument. He was not here to offer help. "Widow Vangen," he said. He did not remove his hat. "Mr. Rourke." He looked past her at the cabin. His eyes moved across the boards, the gaps, the lean-to corner, the roof that Ole had never quite finished sealing. He walked the perimeter without asking permission. He crouched and looked at the foundation, stones that Ole had set in September, not yet settled properly into the earth. He stood at the woodpile and counted with his eyes. "Half a roof worth trusting," he said finally. "Not enough split wood for hard weather. A child too young to ride long in a blow. No man to keep a fire and cut more by dark." Marit said nothing. She knew what he was seeing. She had already counted it herself. Rourke turned to face her directly. His beard was gray, and his eyes were the color of winter sky, pale, hard. Not cruel exactly, but not warm either. He had the look of a man who had stopped hoping for anything except accuracy. "How much money?" "That is not your concern." "It will be everyone's concern when they find you frozen." "How much?" Marit's jaw tightened. $29. "And the dead at doors?" $12 for the boards. So $17 free. That buys you maybe a third of a cord at current prices, which leaves you 5 cords short of surviving." He shook his head slowly. "You cannot cut 5 cords alone. You cannot haul it without a team. You cannot afford to buy it." "I am aware of the arithmetic." "Then you are aware that you should take the boy to town and find passage back to Minnesota." "I cannot afford passage." "Someone will extend it." "And lose the claim? Lose everything Ole built? Lose the only thing I can give my son?" Rourke's expression did not change. "A dead mother gives him nothing." "I did not ask for your opinion, Mr. Rourke." "No, you did not ask." He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up onto the gelding. He looked down at her from the saddle, and for a moment something that might have been pity moved behind his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the flat certainty of a man who had watched too many claims fail. "If you bank on that cabin keeping you warm," he said, "they will find you and the boy stiff before thaw. I have seen it happen. I have helped dig the graves. You cannot burn hope, widow. You cannot heat a house with stubbornness." He gathered the reins. "Sell what you can. Leave before the road closes. There's no shame in knowing when the arithmetic is against you." He rode away without looking back. Marit watched him until he was a small shape against the gray horizon. Then she turned and went inside and sat down at the table her husband had built and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had finished crying at the burial, but she sat there for a long time, feeling the cold seep through the boards, listening to Ever cough in the corner, running the numbers over and over in her head. $29, less than 3 weeks of fuel, a cabin that leaked heat like water through a sieve, a child who might not survive a hard winter, even with adequate warmth, no team, no help, no way out. The arithmetic was against her. Elias Rourke was right. She did not leave. In the days after Rourke's visit, Marit worked. She stuffed rags into the cracks between boards. She hung quilts over the windows to cut drafts. She moved Ivor's cot closer to the stove and built a frame of hung blankets around it to keep the warmed air from dispersing. She rationed the firewood less during the day when she could keep moving, more at night when Ivor needed to sleep without shivering. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. Every night, the frost crept farther across the inside of the walls, and every morning she had to chip ice from the water bucket. The warmth she made bled out through the boards faster than she could replace it. The stove was a small cast iron box designed for a tight cabin, and this cabin was not tight. She was pouring heat into a hole. The realization came on a Thursday afternoon in late October. She had gone to the root cellar to check the potatoes. Ole had dug the cellar in September, a shallow pit, perhaps 4 feet deep, lined with boards on the sides, and a canvas cover weighted with stones. Not a proper cellar, but enough to keep frost off the vegetables for a few extra weeks. The cellar was warmer than the cabin. Marit stood at the edge of the pit, with her hands on her hips, frowning at this fact. The air outside was cold enough to sting her face. The air in the cabin, even with the stove fed, was barely above freezing at the walls. But the air in the cellar, the air surrounded by packed earth and board, felt almost mild. She climbed down into the pit and pressed her palm against the board lining. The wood was cool but not cold. Behind it, she knew, was compacted earth, soil that had absorbed summer's warmth and was releasing it slowly, the way a stone holds heat long after the fire dies. Her father's voice came to her then, a memory from childhood, sharp and sudden. They had been repairing a root cellar on the family's farm in southeastern Minnesota. Marit was perhaps 8 years old, helping carry tools, watching her father work. The cellar was cut into a riverbank, earth on 3 sides, and a board door on the 4th. Her father had crouched beside her and pressed her small hand against the packed dirt wall. "Feel that," he had said. "Still warm, even with frost on the ground. Do you know why?" She had not known. "Thin boards answer the weather," he had told her. "They warm fast and cool fast, like a leaf on the wind, but thick ground answers slow. It takes all summer to warm the earth down deep. It takes all winter to cool it again. The ground remembers what the air forgets." She had been 8 years old. The lesson had meant nothing, filed away in the part of her mind where children store things they do not yet need. But standing in the root cellar 20 years later, she felt that memory rise up like something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Thick ground answers slow. The ground remembers what the air forgets. She climbed out of the cellar and walked to the cabin. She pressed her palm against the outer wall. The boards were cold, not just cool, cold, the kind of cold that pulled heat out of her skin. She went inside and pressed her palm against the same wall from the inner face. Cold there too, even with the stove burning 6 feet away. The wall was a single thickness of milled board. It offered almost nothing between inside and outside. What heat the stove made, the wall gave away. But if the wall were not just boards, if the wall were boards with something thick and dense between them, if she could make the wall answer slow instead of fast, the thought was half-formed and probably foolish. She had no training in building. She knew nothing about how houses held or lost heat. She only knew that the root cellar was warmer than the cabin, and the root cellar had earth behind its boards, and her father had told her once that thick ground answered slow. She stood in the middle of her inadequate cabin with the frost crawling up the walls and her son coughing in the corner and her fuel supply dwindling by the hour, and she thought, what if I could make this cabin remember warmth the way the earth does? The idea came in pieces over the following days. She could not tear down the cabin and rebuild it from sod. She lacked the time, the strength, and the material, but she could add to what was already there. She could build a second wall outside the first, leaving a gap between them. She could fill that gap with something dense, not earth, too heavy, too prone to settling and rot against wood, but something with weight, something that would absorb the heat she made with the stove and release it slowly when the fire died down. Sand. The creek that ran 3 miles to the east had banks of river sand exposed where summer floods had cut new channels. Dry sand, clean sand, dense enough to have weight, loose enough to pour. She had seen it there when she and Ole had walked the property in August, had noted it as a curiosity without any thought of use. Sand between the walls. The logic assembled itself in her mind like a puzzle coming together. A single board wall cooled as fast as the air outside. But if she built a second layer of boards 10 inches out from the first and filled the cavity with dry sand, the sand would act like the earth in a root cellar. It would absorb heat from the warmed inner wall during the day when she kept the stove fed. It would hold that heat through the evening. It would release it slowly through the night when she could not afford to keep the fire burning high. She would not be trying to stop the heat from leaving. She would be slowing it down, buying time, trading a constant battle for a delayed one. If she could charge the walls with heat during the day, maybe they would keep the room survivable through the night. Maybe. She did not know if it would work. She had no way to calculate how much heat sand could hold, how slowly it would release, how much difference it would make when the temperature dropped 30 or 40 degrees below zero. She only knew that what she had now would kill her and Ivor before spring. Anything else was better than certainty of failure. But the gamble was enormous. Building the outer wall would take boards she could barely afford. Hauling sand would take time she should be spending cutting fuel. Every hour on the walls was an hour not preparing the conventional way. If she was wrong, if the sand did nothing or too little, she would face January with less firewood and a strange doubled cabin that the whole district would call a monument to folly. She would be betting everything on an idea that came from a child's memory of her father's hand pressed against dirt. Nora Halberd came to visit on a cold afternoon in early November. Nora was a practical woman, perhaps 35, with 2 daughters under 10 and a husband who had gone to Yankton for work and had not yet returned. She lived on a claim 4 miles north, in a soddy that her husband had built before the plank lumber became available. She had survived 2 winters on the prairie already. She knew what cold could do. She brought a loaf of bread and a jar of preserved plums, and she sat at Marit's table and looked at the walls with the same assessing eye Elias Rourke had used. "You have been stuffing the cracks," she said. "It is not enough." "No, it never is with board walls." Nora cut a slice of bread and pushed it toward Ivor, who was sitting on his cot wrapped in a quilt. "Our soddy is warmer. The earth keeps it so, but you cannot make sod walls on a frame cabin." "No," Marit agreed. Then, carefully, "but perhaps something similar." She explained the idea, the outer wall, the cavity, the sand, the logic of slowing heat loss instead of stopping it. Nora listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When Marit finished, Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the questions. "How do you keep it dry? Wet sand will rot your boards." "I dry the sand before packing, spread it on canvas in the sun, or near the stove if the weather turns." "What happens when all that weight bows the wall outward?" "I brace every 2 feet, cross pieces between inner and outer walls, nailed firm." "How many loads before snow closes the creek?" Marit hesitated. "I do not know. Enough, I hope." "And if it fails, what have you traded away to build it?" "Time I would have spent cutting fuel, boards I should have used for patching, money I cannot spare." Marit met Nora's eyes. "But the fuel arithmetic does not work, Nora. I cannot cut enough. I cannot buy enough. I cannot haul enough. If I do nothing different, Ivor and I freeze before February. At least this way there's a chance." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Ivor, who was watching them both with eyes too old for 6 years. "Your father," Nora said. "He taught you this? The thick ground answering slow?" "He showed me once, in a root cellar, when I was a girl. I do not know if it will work at this scale. I only know that what I have now will not work at all." Nora nodded slowly. She did not say it was a good idea. She did not say she believed it would succeed, but she did not say it was foolish either. I cannot help you haul, she said finally. I have no team and my girls are too small. But if you need sacks, good sacks, heavy seamed, I have some from the seed delivery that I can spare. It was not belief, but it was not dismissal either. Marit would take it. The next day, Marit walked to Dismay, 17 miles in cold that bit through her coat and made her eyes water. She left Ivor with Nora, wrapped in quilts beside the halberd Sadi's warmer walls, and she walked because she could not afford to hire a wagon and could not spare the time to wait for one. She arrived in town with her feet numb and her face chapped raw, and she went directly to Dorr's lumberyard. Caleb Dorr was a tall man with narrow shoulders and a face that always looked slightly disappointed with whatever it was seeing. He had been in De Smet since the town was founded, had built the lumberyard into the only reliable source of boards for 50 miles, and had learned that frontier desperation was a commodity as valuable as the wood itself. He sold on credit because credit created dependence. He collected debts because collection created leverage. He was not evil exactly, but he had learned that other people's misfortune was often profitable, and he had stopped feeling badly about it. He looked up from his ledger when Marit came through the door, and his expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy, but was probably calculation. Widow Vangen, I heard about Ola. My condolences. Thank you. I need to discuss my account. Of course. You owe $12 for the September delivery. Payment was due at the end of October. I know. I need to extend the deadline. Naturally, these things happen. He made a note in the ledger. I can extend to the end of November at the standard rate, 8% monthly on the unpaid balance. I need more than time. I need more boards. Dorr's pencil stopped moving. He looked up at her with renewed interest. More boards. For what purpose? Cabin improvement. The cabin your husband built? Single thickness plank on post frame? Yes. You want to spend money you do not have on improving a cabin that most people in this district expect you to abandon before spring? Marit felt her face flush, but she kept her voice level. I am not abandoning the claim. No? And how will you heat it through January? I have a plan. A plan? Dorr set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair. Widow Vangen, let me be direct. Your husband was a capable man, and even he struggled with that claim. You have no team, no help, and not enough fuel. Elias Rourke has already told half the county that your situation is hopeless. I hear you have some notion about putting dirt in your walls. Marit went cold. The news had traveled faster than she had expected. Sand, she said, not dirt. Sand, dirt, gravel, what difference does it make? You're talking about filling your walls with earth materials and hoping it keeps you warm. That is not a plan. That is desperation dressed up in a dead man's ideas. It is based on sound principle. Dense materials hold heat longer than dense materials. Dorr laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, more weary, as if he had heard too many desperate explanations. Widow, I have been selling lumber in this territory for 9 years. I have watched people try everything to survive their first winter: clay chinking, hay insulation, doubled canvas, paper stuffing. None of it matters when the temperature hits 30 below and the wind finds every crack. What matters is fuel. What matters is a stove big enough, and fuel enough, and walls tight enough to hold the heat in. Your walls will never be tight enough, not with the gaps your husband left, and you cannot afford enough fuel to make up the difference. Then help me afford it. Extend the boards on the same terms as the extension. The same terms? 8% monthly on how much more debt? He shook his head. No. I will extend your existing $12, but new materials require security. What kind of security? A lien clause. If you default on the total debt by the end of March, I have first claim on the cabin and all improvements. First claim, which meant that if she failed, if she could not pay, Dor would own every board Ole had nailed, every post he had set, the stove, the bed frames, the table, everything, and Dor would benefit from her failure either way. If she paid, he collected interest. If she defaulted, he collected the cabin. The only losing outcome for him was if she somehow succeeded and paid the debt without trouble. "That is not reasonable," she said. "It is perfectly reasonable. It is the standard clause for high-risk extension. Your situation, Widow Vangen, is the definition of high risk. You know I cannot agree to that. Then you cannot have more boards." He picked up his pencil again. "Unless, of course, you have other forms of payment in mind." Marit felt her stomach turn. "Such as?" "The claim itself. You could sell now before winter while there is still value. I would offer you fair price, enough to pay your debts, fund passage back to Minnesota, and give you a small stake to start over somewhere more sensible. Or you could sell partial rights, a quarter share of the acreage, which would let you keep the house and give you working capital. Either way, you walk away from this conversation with options instead of a slow death sentence." He said it so reasonably, so practically, as if he were doing her a favor by offering to take what her husband had died building. "No," Marit said. "Think about it. You do not have to decide today." I said no. Dor's expression hardened. The sympathy, if it had ever been real, drained away. "Then I cannot help you, Widow Vangen. I wish you the best of luck. You will need it." She turned and walked out without another word. Behind her, she heard Dor say to someone in the back of the store, "If dirt kept folks warm, everyone would live in a ditch." Laughter, muffled, male, certain. Marit kept walking. She did not look back. She bought the boards from a farmer named Tolf Lunde, who had overordered in the spring and needed cash for seed. Second-grade planks with some warping, not good enough for furniture but serviceable for walls. She paid $8, more than half her remaining money, and borrowed his wagon for one day to haul them to the claim. She bought 50 pounds of nails from the blacksmith, trading her husband's good axe because she could not afford the price in cash. She walked back to the Hallbird claim to collect Ivor, and she carried him the last 2 miles on her back because he was too tired to walk, and her arms were too numb to hold him any other way. Nora watched her arrive with the boy slumped against her shoulder and the new boards stacked on the borrowed wagon. "You are going through with it," Nora said. It was not a question. "I am going through with it." "Dor will not help you?" "Dor wants my claim. He will not help me keep it." Nora nodded slowly. She did not offer encouragement. She did not tell Marit she believed in the plan, but she helped unload the boards in the last light of the day, and she stayed long enough to help stack them under a canvas tarp, and when she left, she said, "I will bring more sacks tomorrow, and some canvas for drying the sand. It is not much." "It is more than nothing." "It is almost nothing." Nora looked at the cabin, at the inadequate walls, at the frost already forming on the windows. "But I hope you prove Rourke wrong. I hope you prove them all wrong." She walked into the darkness toward her own claim, and Marit stood alone beside the stack of boards that might save her life or prove her final foolishness. The temperature was dropping. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who only understood the ordinary way of doing things? Marit began construction the next morning while Ivor slept. The theory was simple. The execution was brutal. She started with the east wall, the one that faced the worst winter winds. The existing inner wall would stay in place. 6 feet out? No, that was too far. She could not afford that many boards. 10 inches out, she decided, a 10-inch cavity between inner and outer walls. Enough space for significant mass. not so much that the structure would become unwieldy. She measured by hand, marking the ground with a stick where the outer wall's base would run. Then she cut the vertical posts. She had no saw large enough, so she used the hatchet Ole had left, chopping until her shoulders burned and the post was the right length, then starting on the next. By midday, she had 4 posts cut and none of them set. Setting the post required digging. The ground was not yet frozen hard, but it was resistant, compacted clay under a thin layer of topsoil that came up in clods. She used a spade with a cracked handle and a mattock that had belonged to Ole's father. Each post hole was agony, 2 feet deep, 8 inches across. The work took hours. She got 2 posts set before dark. The second day, she set the other 2 posts for the east wall frame and began nailing the horizontal rails between them. The boards she had bought were 8 feet long. The wall was 14 feet long. She would have to splice them, which meant cutting precise angles and nailing them into the rails with enough overlap to hold. Her first splice was crooked. She had to pull the nails and start over. Ivor watched from the doorway, wrapped in blankets. His cough was worse today, a rattling sound that came from deep in his chest. "Mama," he said, "why are you building a second house?" "It is not a second house. It is a warmer house." "How?" She tried to explain it simply, how heat moved from warm places to cold places, how thin walls let heat escape quickly, how thick walls held it longer. He listened with the solemn attention of a child who understood that something important was happening, even if he did not understand the details. "Will it work?" Marit drove another nail. "I do not know, Ivor. I hope so." "What if it does not?" She did not answer that. She drove the nail until the head sank flush with the wood, and then she reached for another. By the end of the first week, she had the outer frame of the east wall completed, posts, rails, and enough boards nailed in place to form a shell. The cavity between inner and outer walls gaped dark and empty, waiting to be filled. She had used 6 of her remaining $11 on more nails, purchased from a traveling hardware man who did not ask questions about why a widow was building walls in November. She had eaten 2 meals a day to stretch the food stores. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. The sand came from the creek. Marit walked the 3 miles in the dark hours before dawn, when Ivor was still asleep and the cold was sharpest. She carried 4 sacks, the heavy seamed ones Nora had given her, and a small spade. The creek bank was exposed where summer floods had cut new channels, and the sand there was fine and clean and dry enough to pour. She filled the sacks until her arms shook. Then she carried them back to the cabin, 100 pounds of sand on her shoulders, walking 3 miles in darkness through cold that made her lungs ache. She made the trip twice the first day, 3 times the second day. By the 4th day, her back was locked in a permanent spasm, and she had to rest for hours before she could move again. The sand had to be dried before packing. She spread it on canvas near the stove, stirring it with her hands to expose the damp grains, waiting until it ran freely through her fingers. Then she carried it to the wall cavity and poured it in from above, using a bucket to control the flow. The first load settled into the cavity and disappeared. She had thought it would fill faster. She had not calculated the volume correctly. The 10-inch gap by 8-foot height by 14-foot length required, she stopped to figure it, over 60 cubic feet of fill. At perhaps 1 cubic foot per sack, she needed 60 trips to the creek minimum. 60 trips. She had made 4. The arithmetic was impossible. Again. But she kept hauling. What else was there to do? On the 9th day of construction, while she was nailing bracing cross pieces between the inner and outer walls to prevent bowing, a man she had never seen before appeared at the edge of her claim. He was old, 60 at least, perhaps older, with a weathered face and hands that looked like they had been carved from walnut. He He wore a heavy coat that had been patched many times and a hat that had lost most of its shape. He stood at the edge of her property line for several minutes, watching her work, before he walked closer. Marit lowered her hammer and waited. She did not know if this was another skeptic come to deliver a verdict, or something worse. "You are the widow," he said. His accent was thick Norwegian, like her father's. "The one building the strange wall. I am Marit Vangen, and you are?" "Soren Eide." He looked at the wall structure, at the bracing, at the bucket of dried sand waiting to be poured. "You are trying to fill that cavity with river sand." "Yes." "How much have you packed so far?" "Perhaps 12 cubic feet, barely a start." He walked to the wall and examined her bracing. He ran his hand along the join where crosspiece met outer board. He crouched and looked at the way she had nailed the bottom rail to the posts. "Too much gap between braces," he said finally. "When you fill higher, the weight will bow the center section outward. You need cross pieces every 2 feet at minimum. You have them every 3. Marit felt her jaw tighten. "I have limited boards." "Then you have a choice. Use fewer boards now and watch your wall bow and crack before spring. Or add braces now and finish with a wall that will hold." He straightened and looked at her directly. "I was a quarryman for 20 years in the old country, then lime burner, then well digger. I know how weight behaves in a cavity. I know how walls fail. And you came here to tell me I'm doing it wrong?" "I came here because I heard what you were building." He did not smile, but something in his expression shifted, a recognition, perhaps. "I heard a widow was trying to put earth behind her walls to hold heat like a root cellar. Everyone in the district calls it madness, but I have seen lime kilns hold heat for days after the fire dies. I have seen stone foundations keep cellars warm through February. You are not mad. You are trying to solve a problem with mass instead of fuel." Marit stared at him. For days she had heard nothing but doubt, nothing but predictions of failure. "I do not have money to pay for help," she said. "I did not ask for money." "Then what do you want?" Soren Eide looked at the wall, at the cabin, at the boy watching from the doorway. "I want to see if it works," he said. "I have spent my life handling weight and heat and stone. I never thought to see someone try to apply the principle to a house. If you will let me help, I will give you what I know, and if it fails, at least I will know I tried." Marit did not answer immediately. She looked at this old man with his patched coat, and his quarryman's hands, and his eyes that held curiosity instead of contempt. "The bracing," she said finally. "Show me where to add it." Soren smiled. It was the first smile she had seen in weeks that held no pity in it. He taught her 3 things that first afternoon. First, dryness mattered more than quantity. Damp sand would transfer heat faster than dry sand, stealing warmth instead of storing it. Worse, damp sand against wood would invite rot by spring. Every load had to be dried thoroughly, spread thin, stirred often, tested by rubbing it between the fingers until it ran like water. Second, weight had to be broken into cells. A single uninterrupted cavity would accumulate so much mass that any structural flaw would cascade into failure. But if she added horizontal boards inside the cavity at 2-foot intervals, shelves, almost, that divided the fill into stacked sections, each section would carry its own weight independently. A crack in one cell would not spread to the others. Third, heat needed a path and a limit. The stove could warm the room, and the room could warm the inner wall, and the inner wall could pass heat into the sand. But where the stove pipe passed through the wall, the temperatures were high enough to scorch sand, warp boards, potentially ignite. She needed sheet metal clearances around the pipe, air gaps, controlled distances. Not just bracing, but fire breaks. She took it in hungrily. This was the knowledge she lacked, the specific, practical wisdom of a man who had handled heavy materials his whole life. Her father's lesson had given her the principle. Soren gave her the execution. "You have good instincts," he said at the end of the afternoon. "The idea is sound. The only question is whether you can finish before the cold makes work impossible." "I will finish." "How much fuel do you have left?" 2 weeks, perhaps less." "And how much wall left to build?" Marit looked at the east frame, barely started, and thought about the north wall and the west wall still untouched. "Most of it," she admitted. Soren nodded. He did not tell her it was impossible. He did not offer false comfort either. "Then we work fast," he said. "And we work smart. No wasted motion, no wasted material. Every board, every nail, every sack of sand must count." He stayed until dark, helping her add the additional bracing, showing her how to cut cleaner joins, demonstrating the technique for testing sand dryness by dropping it from a height and watching how it spread. When he left, he said he would return in the morning. Marit watched him walk into the darkness and felt something she had not felt since Ole died. Not hope exactly, not certainty, but possibility. She worked through the night. The moon was bright enough to see by, and sleep felt like something she could not afford. She cut boards by lantern light, nailed bracing until her shoulders screamed, hauled sand from the canvas drying spread, and poured it into the cavity 1 bucket at a time. By dawn, she had added 8 inches of fill to the east wall's first cell. Ivar woke coughing. Marit stopped working long enough to heat water for tea, to wrap him in quilts, to press her cheek against his forehead and feel the warmth there that might be fever or might be nothing. "You did not sleep," Ivar said. "I will sleep when the walls are done." "When will the walls be done?" Marit looked at the cabin, 1 wall framed, 1 wall barely started, 2 walls not touched. The temperature was dropping. The first snow was coming. The fuel stack was shrinking. Everything depended on finishing before the cold closed in. Everything depended on a gamble she could not calculate and could not afford to lose. "Soon," she said. "Soon, I hope." But she did not know if hope was enough. Chunk 2 continues. Soren returned at first light as promised. He brought with him a bundle of sheet metal scraps he had traded for in town, offcuts from a tinsmith who owed him a favor from well-digging work 3 years prior. The metal was thin but serviceable, and he showed Marit how to bend it into collars that would wrap the stovepipe where it passed through the wall cavity. "Heat rises," he said, demonstrating the fit. "The pipe will be hottest here, at the ceiling pass-through. But the wall cavity traps heat too. If you pack sand directly against the pipe, the sand nearest the metal will bake. Baked sand loses moisture it did not know it had. The boards behind it dry and shrink. Gaps form. In the worst case, the wood chars and catches. So the metal collar creates a barrier. The metal collar creates distance. Heat needs air between itself and the fuel it might ignite." He secured the collar with wire loops. "This will not make the wall fireproof. Nothing makes a wall fireproof, but it gives you margin. Margin is what keeps houses standing." They worked together through the morning, Soren cutting and fitting while Marit hauled sand. His presence changed the rhythm of the labor. Alone, she had been frantic, racing against a deadline she could feel but not see. With Soren, the work became methodical. He planned 3 steps ahead. He measured twice. He never hurried, but he never stopped either. By midday, they had completed the east wall's bracing and filled the first 2 cells to the horizontal shelf line. Marit pressed her palm against the inner board and felt nothing different. The wall was cold. The room was cold. The stove was burning low to conserve fuel. But the structure was taking shape. "How do you know this will work?" she asked during a pause for water. Soren considered the question. "I do not know, not with certainty, but I have seen mass hold heat in kilns and cellars and stone foundations. The principle is sound. The question is scale." He looked at the wall. A lime kiln holds heat because the stone is thick and the cavity is small. Your wall is thinner and the room is larger. The ratio may not favor you, but it will favor you more than no wall at all. That is not a ringing endorsement. I do not give ringing endorsements. I give honest assessments. He set down his water cup. What I can tell you is this. A single board wall loses heat almost as fast as open air. You might as well stand outside and hold a blanket. But mass slows the transfer. The sand will absorb warmth during the day and release it at night. How much warmth, how slowly, that depends on factors I cannot calculate. But the direction is correct. You're solving the right problem. Marit thought about Elias Rourke's verdict, about Caleb Door's mockery, about the arithmetic that said she could not survive. "The direction is correct," she repeated. "I will take that." The north wall went faster than the east. Soren had taught her efficiency. She pre-cut the boards to length before setting the posts, which eliminated the constant back and forth between measuring and sawing. She dug the post holes in sequence, moving down the line with the mattock while her arms were still fresh, then went back to set the posts while her back recovered. She built the bracing frame on the ground and raised it into place with Soren's help, rather than nailing each piece individually at height. 3 days for the north wall frame, 2 more to fill the cavity with sand. The temperature dropped while they worked. Not the killing cold yet, not the 30 below winds that would come in January, but a steady, grinding chill that made the ground harder each morning and left ice in the water bucket by dawn. The first snow came on the 12th day of construction, a thin dusting that melted by noon but warned of heavier falls to come. Marit counted the days, counted the fuel, counted the walls. East wall, complete. North wall, complete. West wall, framed, bracing installed, cavity empty. South wall, untouched, 2 walls done, 2 walls to go. Perhaps 3 weeks of fuel remaining if she kept the fire low during daylight hours. Perhaps less. The sand hauling was destroying her. She made the 3-mile walk to the creek before dawn each day, filled the sacks in darkness, carried them back as the sun rose. Her shoulders had developed a permanent ache that ran from neck to lower back. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from the rough sack fabric. She had lost enough weight that her dress hung loose, and her hip bones showed when she undressed to wash. Soren watched her struggle without comment. He did not offer to take over the hauling. His body was too old for that punishment, and they both knew it. But he found ways to make the work more bearable. He rigged a canvas sling that distributed weight across both shoulders instead of one. He showed her how to pace the walk to conserve energy, steady rhythm, short steps, no rushing uphill. He built a drying rack near the stove that held more sand per load, reducing the number of trips needed between hauling and filling. "You are going to hurt yourself," Ivar said one evening, watching his mother lower herself onto the bed with a groan. "I am already hurting myself, but the walls are going up." "How many more days?" Marit did the calculation. The west wall needed perhaps 4 more days to fill. The south wall would need at least 8, frame, bracing, filling. That was 12 days minimum, assuming no setbacks. 12 days, she said, maybe 14. "And then we will be warm?" "Then we will see." Ivar was quiet for a moment. Then, "Papa would have helped." Marit felt her throat tighten. "Yes, he would have." "Soren helps too." "Yes, he does." "Is Soren going to stay?" Marit did not have an answer for that. Soren had said nothing about staying or leaving. He came each morning, worked until dark, and disappeared to wherever he slept, a boarding house in town, she assumed, or perhaps a claim of his own that he never mentioned. She did not ask. She was afraid that asking would remind him he had no obligation to return. "I do not know," she said finally. "I hope so." On the 16th day, Caleb Dorr rode out to the claim. Marit saw him coming from a distance, a dark shape against the gray sky, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who owned more than he needed and wanted more than he owned. She was on the ladder, pouring sand into the west wall cavity, and she did not climb down when he arrived. Widow Vangen. He looked at the cabin with an expression that mixed contempt and curiosity. "I see you are still building your dirt house. Sand house. And yes, I hear you have help now, the old Norwegian well digger. Soren Eide. He is teaching me what I need to know." Dorr laughed. "Teaching you to fill walls with mud. What a useful skill. I'm sure there will be great demand for it." He walked around the structure, examining the doubled walls, the bracing visible through the gaps not yet filled. "You have used a great deal of lumber, more than I sold you." "I bought boards from Tollef Lund." Lunde. Dorr's eyes narrowed. "He did not tell me he was selling to you." "He was not required to." "No, but it would have been courteous." Dorr stopped at the corner where east wall met north wall, studying the join. "Tell me, Widow Vangen, how much money do you have left?" Marit did not answer. She continued pouring sand. "I will guess. Less than $5. Perhaps less than $3. You have spent everything on boards and nails and whatever else this contraption requires. You have no reserve for food, no reserve for fuel, no reserve for the 100 emergencies that winter brings." He looked up at her on the ladder. "What happens when your son gets sicker? What happens when you need medicine you cannot afford? That is not your concern. It is everyone's concern. Do you think the district will simply let a widow and child freeze? When your experiment fails, someone will have to take you in. Someone will have to feed you. Someone will have to explain to the territorial authorities why a woman died on a claim she should have abandoned months ago." Marit's grip tightened on the sand bucket. "Is there a point to this visit, Mr. Dorr, or did you simply want to remind me that you expect me to fail?" "I came to offer you a final opportunity." Dorr's voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a man making a generous concession. "The lien clause I proposed before. I will reduce the terms. Sign over the lumber rights only, not the claim itself, just the boards, the improvements, the cabin materials, and I will extend your debt indefinitely. No payments due until spring, no interest accruing. If you survive the winter, you pay me back. If you do not survive, I take the boards." It was the same trap in different wrapping. If she survived, she owed him. If she failed, he profited. The only outcome he lost was the one where she succeeded without him. "No," Marit said. "Think carefully. I am offering you insurance, a safety net." "You are offering me a way to lose even if I win." She poured the last of the sand and began climbing down the ladder. "I will take my chances without your safety net." Dorr's expression hardened. "Then you will take the consequences. Do not expect credit from my yard. Do not expect sympathy when January comes and your son is coughing blood and your walls are cracking under the weight of all that sand you put in them. You had a chance to be sensible. You chose to be proud. I chose to keep what is mine. For now." He gathered his reins. "Boards are for walls, Widow Vangen. Earth is for graves. Come January, you will learn which one you have built." He rode away, and Marit stood in the yard watching him go, her hands trembling from exhaustion and anger both. Soren emerged from behind the lean-to where he had been cutting bracing boards. He did not comment on the conversation. He had clearly heard it all. He simply handed her a cup of water and said, "2 more days on the west wall, then we start the south." Marit drank the water. Her hands were still shaking. "Boards are for walls," she repeated. "Earth is for graves." "He has never seen a root cellar in January," Soren said. "He has never pressed his hand against a lime kiln wall 3 days after the fire died. Men like Dor think they know everything because they have seen money work, but money does not know everything. Mass knows things money does not." Marit almost smiled. Almost. "Let us finish the west wall," she said. "I want to see his face when this house is still standing in February." The west wall was complete by the 18th day. The south wall took longer. The south wall faced the direction of least wind, which meant it was the lowest priority for thermal protection. But it was also the wall with the most complications: the door opening, a window opening, and the lean-to corner that jutted out at an angle. Building around these obstacles required custom bracing, angled cuts, and fills that had to be packed by hand rather than poured from above. Marit worked from before dawn until after dark. She ate 1 meal a day to stretch the food stores. She slept 4 hours a night, sometimes less. Her body was failing in increments, a twinge in her knee that worsened daily, a persistent cough that might have been dust or might have been something worse, a tremor in her hands that made precision work difficult. Soren watched her deteriorate without comment. He could not do the heavy hauling himself. His back was too far gone for that, but he took over the cutting and fitting work, freeing her to focus on the sand. He also began teaching her things that had nothing to do with the immediate construction. "You will need to maintain this," he said one evening, showing her how to inspect the wall caps for settling. "Sand compacts over time. The first winter you will lose perhaps an inch of fill in each cell. If you do not refill before the second winter, the gap will act as a cold bridge, a path for heat to escape at the top of the wall. I will remember. You will need to check for moisture too. Snow will find cracks you cannot see. Melt will seep into the cavity. If the sand becomes wet, the wall will lose efficiency and the wood will rot. You have told me. I am telling you again because you will need to tell others." He secured the capboard and moved to the next section. "This idea of yours, sand walls, mass retention, it is not going to stay a secret. People will see your cabin standing while others fail. They will ask how. You will need to teach them." Marit had not thought that far ahead. She was still focused on surviving, not on what came after. "Teach the errors too," Soren said. "Where you braced wrong at first, where you packed too wet, where you almost let the pipe get too close. The errors are as important as the successes. They teach people what to avoid." "You sound like you are preparing me for something." Soren was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am an old man. I have no claim, no family, no place that needs me. I came here because I wanted to see if your idea would work, but I will not always be here. The knowledge cannot live in me alone." Marit felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You are leaving?" "Not yet, but eventually. Everyone leaves eventually." He looked at her with eyes that held no sentimentality, only truth. "You're building something worth passing on. Make sure you can pass it on without me." The south wall was complete on the 26th day. Marit stood in the yard and looked at her cabin with the eyes of a stranger. The structure had transformed. What had been a flimsy plank shell was now a blunt, doubled box, thick walls rising 8 feet to the roof line, the outer boards rough and unpainted but solid. The building looked heavier. It looked like something that meant to stay. She pressed her palm against the outer wall. Cold, of course. The outside was supposed to be cold. She went inside and pressed her palm against the inner wall. Also cold. The stove was burning low, fuel rationed, barely maintaining the room above freezing. But this was not the test. The test would come when she heated the room properly and the sand had time to absorb and hold. The test would come when the fire dropped and the question became whether the walls would give back what she had stored. That night she fed the stove higher than she had in weeks. She burned 2 full hours' worth of wood, filling the room with warmth that felt almost decadent after so many cold days. Ivor sat on his cot and smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him since his father died. "It is warm," he said. "Yes, like summer. Not like summer, but warmer than it has been." She let the fire burn high until bedtime, then banked it to coals, enough to keep from dying, not enough to actively heat. Then she waited. The cabin had always cooled fast. On previous nights, by the time she woke at dawn, the room would be barely warmer than the outside air. Frost would rim the inner walls. The water bucket would be solid. The cold would sit in the room like something that had moved in and claimed the space. This time was different. Marit woke at 3 in the morning, driven by habit and fear. She reached out from under the quilts and touched the air, cool but not frigid, not the biting cold she expected. She rose and crossed to the wall, pressing her palm against the boards. The wall was warm, not hot, not summer warm, but perceptibly warmer than the air, warmer than her hand, warmer than it had any right to be hours after the fire dropped. She could feel the heat leaving the sand behind the boards, slow, steady, like a heartbeat she had never known the house could have. She fed the stove back to life and sat in front of it, shaking. It was working. Elias Rourke returned 3 days before Christmas. Marit was outside checking the wall caps for settling when she saw him riding toward the claim on the same gray gelding. She did not stop her work. She watched him approach from the corner of her eye and continued tamping the capboards. He dismounted and stood looking at the cabin for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. "You finished it," he said finally. "I finished it." "The whole thing? All 4 walls?" "All 4 walls. 10-inch cavity, river sand fill, braced and capped." Rourke walked to the nearest wall, the east wall, the first one she had built, and pressed his palm against the outer boards. Then he walked inside without asking permission. Marit followed. The stove was burning at medium heat, the room warmer than any single wall cabin had a right to be in late December. Rourke crossed to the inner wall and laid his palm flat against the boards. He held it there for several seconds. "Warm," he said. "The sand holds what the stove makes. It releases overnight." "How much difference?" "Enough. The room stays above freezing through the night. The walls are still warm at dawn." Rourke turned to face her. His expression was still guarded, but something had shifted behind his eyes, something that might have been surprise, or respect, or simply recalculation. "You banked the stove last night?" "Coals only, 6 hours." "And the room temperature this morning?" "Cold enough to see my breath, but not cold enough to freeze the water bucket." Rourke was quiet for a long time. He looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the stovepipe with its sheet metal collars visible where it passed through the wall cavity. He looked at Ivor, who was watching from his cot with wary eyes. "I said they would find you stiff before thaw," Rourke said finally. "You did." "I may have been wrong." It was not an apology. Elias Rourke did not apologize, but it was acknowledgement, and from him that was nearly the same thing. "The real test is January," he continued. "A gentleman's freeze is not a killing cold. When it drops to 30 below and the wind finds every gap and the fire cannot keep up with what the walls lose, that is when we will know." "I know." But you have given yourself a chance. He put his hand on the wall one more time, feeling the heat stored in the sand. More than a chance. You have given yourself something I have not seen before. He left without saying goodbye, but at the door he paused and looked back. If this works through January, he said, I want to know how you built it, the bracing, the fill depth, all of it. Then he was gone, and Marit stood alone in her warm room with tears on her face that she did not bother to wipe away. Christmas came and went without celebration. Marit had no money for presents, no energy for festivity. She gave Ivor an extra portion of preserved plums and told him stories about his father until he fell asleep. Then she sat by the stove and watched the walls hold their heat and tried not to think about what January would bring. Soren came on Christmas afternoon with a gift that was not a gift, a notebook filled with diagrams, wall cross-sections, bracing patterns, fill depths, clearance measurements for stovepipes, everything she had built, drawn out in his careful hand so that anyone could follow it. For teaching, he said, when people ask, you drew all of this. I've been drawing it for weeks. Every time you made a mistake and fixed it, I added the correction. Every time we found a better method, I added that too. He set the notebook on the table. This is not my idea to give away. It is yours, but ideas die if they stay in one head. This way it can spread. Marit paged through the drawings. The detail was remarkable, every joint, every measurement, every annotation about what worked and what did not. A complete manual for building a sand wall cabin, created by a man who had nothing to gain from it except the satisfaction of seeing knowledge survive. Why are you doing this? She asked. Soren considered the question. When I was young, I learned the lime-burning trade from a man named Björn Helland. He was old when I knew him, older than I am now, and he spent his last years teaching everything he knew to anyone who would listen. I asked him once why he bothered. He said that knowledge kept in the head dies with the head. Knowledge written down outlives the man who learned it. He touched the notebook. I am old, Marit. My body is failing. But this, what you built, what I helped you understand, this can go on after I am gone. That is worth more than any payment. Marit did not trust herself to speak. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. Thank you, she said finally, for everything. Do not thank me yet. January is coming. January came like a door slamming shut. Marit woke on the morning of January 12th to a silence that pressed against the cabin like a weight. No wind, no creak of boards. Even Ivor's breathing seemed muted, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. She rose and crossed to the window. The glass was so heavily frosted that she could see nothing through it, only a pale gray glow where the dawn should be. She scraped a circle clear with her thumbnail and looked out at a world transformed. Snow had fallen in the night, not the thin dustings of December, but a heavy, smothering blanket that had buried the yard knee-deep. The sky beyond the snow was the color of iron, flat and low and threatening. In the cold, she could feel the cold even through the glass, a presence that seemed almost conscious, probing for weakness. She dressed quickly and added fuel to the stove. The room was cool, but not cold. The sand walls had held through the night, releasing their stored heat the way Soren had promised. But as she stoked the fire higher, she felt the temperature outside dropping. She could feel it in the boards, in the way the frost crept a little higher along the inner walls, in the quality of the light pressing through the frosted window. Mama? Ivor's voice was thick with sleep. Is something wrong? Stay in bed. Stay under the quilts. Why? Because it is going to be very cold today. By noon, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees from dawn. Marit knew because she could feel it in her skin when she stepped outside to retrieve more fuel from the stack. The air bit into her lungs like something with teeth. The snow squeaked under her boots with that particular sound that only came when the cold was deep and dry and deadly. She hauled wood into the lean-to, as much as she could carry in 3 trips, enough for 2 days of hard burning. Then she sealed the door behind her and did not go out again. Soren arrived in the early afternoon, frost thick on his beard and his movements stiff with cold. "It is coming," he said. "The weather-wise say tonight will be the worst, 40 degrees below with wind, maybe colder." "How do you know?" "I talked to a freighter this morning. He is not going anywhere. No one is going anywhere. This is a killing cold, Marit, the kind that finds every crack and punishes every mistake." Marit looked at the walls she had built with her own hands, with Soren's knowledge, with sand hauled 3 miles at a time on her ruined back, the walls that had to work because there was no alternative. "Stay," she said. "Do not try to get back to town in this." "I was not planning to." He sat down heavily on the bench by the stove. "I want to see if it holds. I want to see what we built." The cold arrived at sunset like an army breaking through a gate. Marit had spent the afternoon heating the room as hot as she dared, burning fuel at a rate that terrified her, trying to push as much warmth as possible into the sand before the true test began. The inner walls grew warm to the touch. The room became almost stuffy, hot enough that Ivar threw off his quilts and complained. "I know," Marit said, "but we need the walls to remember this heat. Tonight they will have to give it back." Outside, the wind began to rise. At first it was just a whisper, a sound like breathing against the boards. Then it grew, a moan, a howl, a sustained roar that made conversation difficult. The cabin shuddered under the pressure. Snow drove against the walls with a hissing sound, finding every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the outer shell. Marit watched the inner wall. The frost line was her enemy. In a single-board cabin, frost would be creeping across the inner surface by now, stealing heat from the room faster than the stove could replace it. But the sand walls were different. The frost line stayed low, ankle height, maybe a little higher, while the rest of the wall remained clear. "It is working," Soren said quietly. "It is holding. For now." The temperature continued to drop. Marit could feel it in the way the stove had to work harder to maintain the same room temperature, in the way the windows went opaque with frost until no light could penetrate, in the way every breath she took felt like it was being pulled from her lungs rather than given. By 8 o'clock, Ivar was coughing again. The cough had never fully left him since autumn, but tonight it was worse. Deep, wet, rattling coughs that made his small body shake. Marit moved his cot against the warmest wall, the east wall, the first she had built, and hung quilts to create a smaller heated space around him. She heated water and made him breathe the steam. She piled blankets on top of him until only his face showed. The cough continued. "He needs to stay warm," Soren said. "If the fever rises, I know. If he cannot breathe, I know." There was nothing else to say. They could not take him to town. The cold would kill him before they got a mile. They could not call a doctor. No one was traveling tonight, and even if they could, there was no way to pay. All they could do was keep him warm and hope the cough did not become pneumonia. Marit sat beside her son's cot and listened to him breathe. The wind screamed outside. The walls held their heat. The fire burned. At midnight, someone pounded on the door. Marit's first thought was that it was a mistake, that the wind had thrown something against the boards, that an animal had wandered close seeking shelter. But the pounding came again, rhythmic, desperate. A human fist against frozen wood. Soren moved to the door. "Who is it?" "Rourke." The voice was barely audible over the wind. Elias Rourke, open the door. Soren lifted the latch and the wind slammed the door inward, driving a sheet of snow into the room. Rourke stumbled through the gap with two children clinging to his arms, small figures wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, their faces barely visible beneath frost-rimed scarves. Soren slammed the door shut behind them. The room fell into something like quiet, the wind still roaring outside but no longer inside. Rourke was shaking. Ice clung to his beard, his eyebrows, the edges of his coat. He held the children against his sides with an urgency that looked like fear. "Nora's children," he said. His voice was cracked, barely human. "The Halberd girls, their soddy is failing. The roof is leaking cold, ice forming inside. Nora sent them to me because my claim is closer, but my cabin—" He stopped, swallowed. "My cabin is no warmer than theirs. I could not keep them there. I could not." Marit looked at the two girls. They were perhaps 8 and 6 years old, small for their ages, shivering despite the layers of clothing. Their eyes were huge and dark, and filled with a fear that went beyond cold. "Bring them to the stove," she said. Rourke guided the girls toward the heat. Soren helped him peel away the outer layers, frozen coats that crackled when they bent, scarves stiff with ice, mittens that had to be worked off finger by finger because they had frozen to the skin beneath. "Their toes," Rourke said. "Check their toes." The oldest was complaining. Marit knelt and took the older girl's feet in her hands. The toes were pale, waxy, not yet black, but dangerously close. She began rubbing them gently, working blood back into the tissue, watching the color slowly return. "How far did you walk?" she asked. 2 miles, maybe more. I lost the path twice in the drifts." 2 miles in this cold with 2 children. Marit looked at Rourke and saw a man who had done something impossible because the alternative was worse. "You will stay here," she said. "All of you, until the cold breaks. Your fuel. We will manage. Your son is sick. I heard him coughing when we came in. You cannot take on more bodies to heat. Mr. Rourke." Marit's voice was steady in a way that surprised her. "You told me this cabin would be my grave. You told me I would be stiff before thaw. Look around you. Feel the walls. This house is not a grave. It is holding, and it will hold for you too." Rourke stared at her for a long moment. Then he pressed his palm against the inner wall, the same wall he had tested before Christmas, and felt the heat stored in the sand, still radiating into the room hours after the last heavy feeding of the stove. "My God," he said softly. "It works. It works." Marit turned back to the children. "Now help me get them warm." If you're invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. The night became a kind of siege. 6 bodies in a room built for 2. The stove burning constantly, fed in shifts, someone always awake to add wood and stir the coals. The sand walls absorbing heat during each feeding and releasing it slowly as the fire dropped, buying time, smoothing out the desperate rhythm of burn and wait. Evers' cough worsened at 3 in the morning. He woke choking, struggling to breathe, his face flushed with fever. Marit held him upright and pounded his back until the phlegm broke loose, then laid him down again and covered him with every quilt she could spare. The Halberd girls watched from their nest of blankets by the stove, eyes huge with a fear they were too young to name. "Will the boy be all right?" the older one asked. "Yes," Marit said with a certainty she did not feel. "He will be fine." Outside, the wind reached a pitch that sounded like screaming. The walls shuddered under the assault. Frost crept higher along the inner boards, 8 inches now, then 12. climbing toward the place where the sand fill ended and the ceiling began. But it climbed slowly, grudgingly, fighting against the mass that pushed back. Soren watched the frost line with the attention of a man reading a text he had studied all his life. "It is holding," he said at 4 in the morning. "The line should be at the ceiling by now in a normal cabin. In yours it is barely at knee height. Is that enough?" "It is more than enough, much more." He looked at her with something that might have been pride. "You built well, Marit, better than you know." At 5 in the morning, one of the halberd girls woke crying from a nightmare. Marit held her until she stopped shaking, then settled her back into the blankets beside her sister. The stove was running low. Marit added more wood and watched the flames catch. At 6 in the morning, the first gray light appeared at the edges of the frosted windows. At 7, the wind began to die. By 8, Marit could see the outline of the sun through the frost, a pale disk climbing above the horizon into a sky that was finally, mercifully clear. She stepped outside at 9 o'clock, into a world that had been scoured clean by cold. The snow was blinding white, sculpted by wind into drifts that reached the cabin's eaves in places. The air was still bitterly cold, but the wind was gone, and without wind, the cold was survivable. She could breathe without pain. She could stand without shivering. The thermometer on the cabin's outer wall read 34 degrees below zero. Marit stared at that number for a long time. 34 below. The kind of cold that killed livestock, that froze the breath in your lungs, that found every weakness and exploited it without mercy. The kind of cold that should have made her cabin uninhabitable. She went back inside. The room was cool, but not cold. 50 degrees perhaps, maybe a little lower. The stove was burning at half capacity. The walls were still warm to the touch. Elias Rourke was sitting at the table with his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and something else, something that looked like wonder. "I have been through 8 winters on this prairie," he said. "I have seen men and women and children die because their cabins could not hold the heat. I've dug graves in frozen ground and cursed God for making this country so cruel." He shook his head slowly. "I never thought I would see a board cabin survive a night like that. I never thought it was possible." "It was not the boards," Marit said. "It was what we put behind them. The sand. The sand, the mass, the idea that a wall can remember warmth and give it back." She sat down across from him. "My father told me once that thick ground answers slow. He was talking about a root cellar. I do not think he ever imagined someone would build a house on that principle." "But you did." "I did not have a choice. The arithmetic would not let me survive any other way." Rourke was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the wall and pressed his palm flat against the boards. The same gesture he had made before, but different now, weighted with new meaning. "I was wrong about you, Widow Vangen," he said. "I was wrong about all of it." It was the closest Elias Rourke would ever come to an apology. Marit accepted it in the spirit it was given. The cold continued for 3 more days, though never again as severe as that first terrible night. The household stayed together. Marit and Ivar, Soren, Rourke, the 2 halberd girls, because traveling remained dangerous, and there was safety in numbers. They rationed the remaining fuel, fed the stove in careful intervals, and let the walls do the work they were built to do. On the 4th day, Nora Halberd arrived. She had walked the 4 miles from her soddy through waist-deep drifts, driven by terror for her daughters. She burst through the door with ice in her hair and tears freezing on her cheeks, and she gathered her girls into her arms and did not let go for a long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes moved across the room, the doubled walls, the frost line barely visible at the floor, the warmth that filled the space like something you could touch. "They said your cabin survived," she said. "They said it held heat when every other board house failed. I did not believe them." "It held," Marit said. "The walls held." Nora rose and crossed to the inner wall. She pressed her palm against the boards, just as Rourke had done, just as Soren had taught Marit to do when testing the retained heat. "Warm," she said. "Still warm. The sand stores what the stove makes. It gives it back slowly." Nora turned to look at her with an expression Marit could not immediately read. It took her a moment to realize it was not surprise or gratitude. It was hunger. "I need you to show me," Nora said. "I need you to teach me how to do this. My soddy is warm enough most days, but on nights like this—" She stopped, swallowed. "I cannot risk my girls again. I need walls like yours." "It takes time, materials, labor." "I have time. I will find materials, and I will do the labor myself if I have to." Marit looked at Soren, who was watching from his place by the stove. He gave her the smallest nod. "Then I will teach you," Marit said. "Everything I know." Ivar's fever broke on the 5th day. Marit woke to find him sitting up in bed, his color improved, his breathing easier than it had been in weeks. The cough was still there, but diminished, no longer the deep rattling sound that had made her fear pneumonia, but a shallow clearing that would fade with time and warmth. "I am hungry," he said. Marit laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since October. She made him porridge with the last of the oats and gave him double portions of everything she could spare. He ate like a child who had forgotten what eating felt like, and when he was done, he looked at the walls with a curiosity that reminded her of his father. "The walls kept us warm," he said. "Yes." "The sand in the walls." "Yes." "That was smart, Mama." Marit felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away. "It was necessary," she said. Sometimes the smart thing and the necessary thing are the same. By the end of January, word had spread across the district. People came to see the cabin that had survived the killing cold. They came skeptical and left convinced. They pressed their palms against the walls, asked questions about bracing and fill depth and drying methods, and went away with pages torn from Soren's notebook or notes scribbled on whatever paper they could find. The method was spreading. Marit did not count the visitors. She did not keep track of who had come or what they had learned. She simply answered questions when asked, demonstrated techniques when needed, and let the knowledge flow outward like heat from a wall, slowly, steadily, in every direction at once. Caleb Dorr did not come, but Marit heard through others that he had lost 3 outbuildings to the cold, storage sheds built cheap, single-board construction, walls that had cracked and split when the temperature plunged. His losses were small compared to others, but they were losses, and they came with the knowledge that a widow he had mocked had built something better than he had. She did not gloat. She did not confront him. There would be time for that later, when the memory of the cold was fresh enough to wound and old enough to teach. For now, she had a son to care for, walls to maintain, and a method to share. The impossible situation had become simply a situation. The unconventional idea had become the idea that saved her life. The arithmetic, for the first time since October, was finally in her favor. Chunk 3 continues. The cold broke on the last day of January, and with it broke the isolation that had gripped the district for 3 weeks. Wagons began moving again. Smoke rose from chimneys that had gone cold. People emerged from their shelters like animals after a long hibernation, blinking at the sun and counting what they had lost. Marit counted too. She had burned through nearly all her remaining fuel. The stack that had seemed adequate in December was now reduced to perhaps 10 days of careful burning. She had spent the last of her money on food during the siege, feeding 6 mouths instead of 2. She had nothing left but the claim, the cabin, and the knowledge that both had held when others had not. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The first teaching happened 3 days after the thaw. Nora Halbert arrived at dawn with a wagon borrowed from a neighbor and a determination that bordered on desperation. Her soddy had survived the cold, but barely. The roof had leaked in 2 places. The earthen walls had cracked where moisture had frozen and expanded, and one corner had begun to sag in a way that suggested structural failure by next winter. "I cannot rebuild in sod," she said. "I do not have the time or the help, but I can reinforce what I have. I can add mass where the walls are weakest." Marit walked her through the principles. They stood in the yard beside the doubled walls, and Marit explained what Soren had taught her, how density slowed heat transfer, how dry fill outperformed wet, how bracing prevented the weight from bowing the structure. She showed Nora the notebook with its careful diagrams, the cross-sections, the measurements, the annotations about errors and corrections. "You do not need to double your entire wall," Marit said. "Your soddy already has mass. What you need is to seal the gaps where cold bridges form, the cracks, the corners, the places where different materials meet." "How do I seal them?" "Pack them with dry material. Sand if you can get it, dry earth if you cannot. Then cover the pack with boards to hold it in place and protect it from moisture." Nora studied the diagrams with the focus of a woman memorizing scripture. She asked questions about drying times, about weight limits, about how to test whether fill was properly compacted. Marit answered what she could and admitted what she did not know. "I built one cabin," she said. "I do not know everything. I only know what worked for me." "That is more than anyone else knows." They spent the morning planning Nora's reinforcement project. By noon, Nora had a list of materials, a sequence of steps, and something she had not had before, confidence that the work could be done. "I will start tomorrow," she said, "before the next cold comes. Come back if you have questions. Come back if something goes wrong." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She embraced Marit briefly, fiercely, like a sister parting for a journey. "You saved my daughters," she said. "That night, if Rourke had not brought them here, if your walls had not held, they held. That is what matters." "No." Nora pulled back, her eyes bright. "What matters is that you built something worth holding. What matters is that you are teaching others to do the same. That is what matters." She climbed onto the wagon and drove away, and Marit stood in the yard watching until she disappeared over the rise. The first teaching was complete. Others would follow. Elias Rourke returned a week later, on a morning when the sky was clear and the temperature had climbed to merely bitter. He did not come alone. With him rode a man Marit had never seen, younger than Rourke, perhaps 40, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years outdoors. He introduced himself as Halvor Grindheim, a homesteader from a claim 12 miles north. "Halvor lost his brother in the cold," Rourke said. "Bachelor claim, single-wall cabin. The stove went out sometime after midnight and he could not get it relit." Marit felt the news like a blow. She had not known the man, had never heard his name, but she understood what that death meant. A cabin that had not held, a fire that had failed, a body found frozen in the morning. "I'm sorry," she said. Halvor nodded. His face was expressionless, but his eyes held something that might have been grief, or might have been anger, or might have been both. "Rourke tells me your cabin survived," he said. He tells me you put sand in the walls and the room stayed warm through the worst of it. Yes. I want to know how. Marit looked at Rourke. He met her gaze steadily. I told him what I saw, Rourke said. I told him about the walls, the fill, the way the heat held overnight. But I cannot explain the method. That is your knowledge to share. Marit nodded slowly. Then she turned to Halvor. Come inside, she said. I will show you. She walked him through the cabin the way Soren had walked her through the root cellar, touching the walls, explaining the principles, demonstrating how the heat moved from stove to room to sand and back again. She showed him the bracing, the capboards, the sheet metal collars around the stovepipe. She gave him pages from the notebook and answered his questions with as much detail as she could provide. Halvor listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. My brother's cabin was built the same as mine, he said finally. Same lumber, same design, same gaps in the boards. If I do nothing different, I will die the same way. Then do something different. I will. He looked at the walls one more time. I will start as soon as the ground thaws enough to dig post holes. I will double every wall, fill every cavity, brace every corner, and when the next killing cold comes, I will be ready. He left with the notebook pages folded carefully in his coat pocket. Rourke stayed behind. That is 3 people you have taught now, Rourke said. Nora Halberd, her neighbor who came yesterday, and Halvor. Word is spreading. Word should spread. The method works. Yes, it does. Rourke paused. Dor is not pleased. Marit felt her jaw tighten. Dor is rarely pleased by anything that does not profit him. He is telling people your walls are a trick, that the sand will settle and create gaps, that the weight will collapse the structure by spring, that anyone who copies your method will regret it. And do people believe him? Some do. The ones who did not lose anyone in the cold. The ones who think they know better because they have always done things a certain way. Rourke shook his head. But others, the ones who lost family, the ones who spent that night wondering if dawn would come, they believe you. They believe what they can see and touch and feel. Then let Dor talk. The walls will answer for themselves. Rourke almost smiled. It was the first time Marit had seen anything like warmth in his expression. You sound like a woman who has stopped being afraid, he said. I sound like a woman who has other things to worry about. Marit crossed her arms. I need fuel for the rest of winter. I need food for my son. I need to maintain these walls and prepare for next year. Dor's opinion is not on that list. Fair enough. Rourke turned to leave, then paused at the door. I was wrong about you, Widow Van Gun. I said that before, but I want to say it again. I was wrong, and I am glad of it. Thank you, Mr. Rourke. Elias. My friends call me Elias. He left, and Marit stood alone in her warm cabin and thought about what it meant to be called friend by a man who had once predicted her death. Soren grew weaker as February progressed. Marit noticed it first in the way he moved, slower than before, more careful, as if every step required calculation. Then she noticed it in his breathing, a shallow rasp that worsened when he exerted himself, a persistent cough that reminded her too much of Ivor's autumn sickness. Then she noticed it in his eyes, a dimming of the sharp curiosity that had driven him to her claim in the first place. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not need to. She had seen enough death to recognize its approach. He came to work anyway. Every morning he walked the 2 miles from wherever he slept. She still did not know where, still did not ask, and spent the day helping her with maintenance, with teaching, with the small improvements that would make the cabin stronger for next winter. He worked until his hands shook and his breath came in gasps, and then he sat by the stove, and talked while she continued. The talking was new. Before the crisis, Soren had been a man of action, not words. He taught through demonstration, through correction, through the patient repetition of technique until it became instinct. But now, as his body failed, he began to share the stories behind the knowledge. I learned lime burning from a man named Björn Helland, he said one afternoon, while Marit was recaulking the window frames. He was old when I knew him, older than I am now, and he had spent his whole life handling heat. Kilns, foundries, bread ovens. He knew how warmth moved through stone the way a sailor knows how wind moves through sails. What did he teach you? Everything. How to build a kiln that would hold temperature for days. How to read the color of flame and know when the fire was too hot or too cold. How to choose stone that would conduct heat evenly instead of cracking from thermal shock. Soren coughed, a wet sound that made Marit wince. But the most important thing he taught me was this. Heat is patient. It does not rush. It does not skip steps. It moves from hot to cold, always, in every direction at once. And the only way to stop it is to slow it down. That is what the walls do. That is what the walls do. Björn would have understood your idea immediately. He would have seen the logic and admired the execution. Soren smiled, a thin expression that did not quite reach his eyes. He died in the winter of '64, pneumonia. I was with him at the end. I am sorry. Do not be. He lived a full life and died with his knowledge passed on. That is all any of us can hope for. He looked at her directly. When I am gone, you will carry what I taught you. That is how knowledge survives. One hand to another, one generation to the next. Marit set down the caulking tool. You are not dying yet. I'm always dying. We all are. The question is only how much time remains. He coughed again, longer this time. I have enough time to finish what we started. That is what matters. The disagreement came in late February, over a question Marit had not anticipated. A family from a claim 8 miles south had sent word that they wanted to hire Marit to build sand walls for them. They had money, not much, but enough to pay for labor and materials, and they wanted the work done before next winter. They were offering $40 for a complete installation. $40. More money than Marit had seen since before Ole died. Enough to buy food for months, fuel for next winter, supplies for the improvements she still needed to make. Enough to transform her from a widow surviving on charity and stubbornness into a woman with a trade. Soren said no. You should not take money for this, he said. The conversation happened in the cabin, with Ivar playing quietly in the corner and the stove burning low. The knowledge should be free. The knowledge is free. I have taught everyone who has asked, but the labor is different. If I spend weeks building walls for someone else, I am not building walls for myself. I am not maintaining my own claim. I am not caring for my son. Then teach them to do it themselves. I have been teaching them, but some people cannot do the work themselves. They are too old, too sick, too busy with their own claims. They need help. Soren shook his head. When you charge money, the knowledge becomes a commodity, something to be bought and sold, something that belongs to whoever can afford it. The knowledge still belongs to everyone. The notebook is still here. Anyone can read it. Anyone can learn. But if someone wants my hands and my time, they should pay for what they are taking. And if they cannot pay, then I teach them for free, as I always have. They argued about it for an hour. It was the first real disagreement they had ever had, and it surprised Marit how much it hurt. Soren had been her teacher, her partner, the one person who had believed in her idea from the beginning. To be at odds with him felt like a betrayal of something she could not name. In the end, he relented, not because she convinced him, but because his body would not let him continue. He slumped back in his chair, coughing, and waved his hand in a gesture of surrender. "Do what you must," he said. "You are the one who will live with the consequences. I am just an old man with opinions." "You are more than that." "Perhaps, but not for much longer." He met her eyes. "Take the work, Marit. Build the walls, earn the money. Just remember that the most valuable thing you have is not the labor, it is the knowledge. Do not let the labor overshadow it." Marit accepted the commission. She would begin work in April, when the ground thawed and the building season opened. It would be the first money she had earned since Ole's death, and it would come from something she had built with her own hands and her own mind. She did not know it then, but it would also be the last work Soren would see her begin. He died on the 4th day of March. Marit found him in the morning, sitting in the chair by her stove where he had spent so many hours teaching and talking and watching her work. He had come the evening before, complaining of tiredness, and she had insisted he stay the night rather than walk back to town in the cold. He had sat by the fire while she put Ivar to bed, and they had talked about spring, about the commission, about improvements to the cabin, about the people who would come asking for help once the building season began. When she woke, he was still in the chair. His eyes were closed. His hands were folded in his lap. He looked peaceful, like a man who had finished a long day of work and allowed himself finally to rest. She knew before she touched him, but she touched him anyway, his cheek, his hand, the place on his chest where his heart had stopped beating sometime in the dark hours of the night. His skin was cool but not cold. The stove had kept him warm even as he died. Ivar woke to find his mother sitting on the floor beside the old man's chair, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with grief she had not known she possessed. He did not ask what had happened. He was 6 years old, and he had already buried his father. He knew what death looked like. "Is Soren gone?" he asked. "Yes." Marit's voice cracked. "He is gone." Ivar crossed the room and sat down beside her. He put his small hand on her arm and said nothing. They stayed like that for a long time, the two of them and the body of the man who had taught them how to survive. She buried him beside Ole on the rise overlooking the claim. Elias Rourke came to help dig the grave. Nora Hallberg came with her daughters. Halvor Grenheim came from his claim 12 miles north, though he had only met Soren once. Others came too, people Marit had taught, people who had heard the stories, people who understood that something valuable had been lost. They lowered him into the ground wrapped in a canvas shroud, and Marit spoke words she had not prepared. Soren Eide was a quarryman, a lime burner, a well digger, and a teacher. He came to this claim because he wanted to see if an idea would work. He stayed because the idea became something worth protecting. He taught me everything I needed to know to survive last winter, and he asked nothing in return except that I pass the knowledge forward. She looked at the small crowd gathered in the cold morning light. "I will pass it forward. As long as I live, as long as I can teach, the things he showed me will not die with him. That is what he wanted. That is what I promised." She dropped a handful of frozen earth onto the shroud. Others followed. The grave filled slowly, shovel by shovel, until the mound was complete. Rourke stayed after the others left. "He was a good man," he said. "He was the best man I have known since my husband died." "What will you do now?" Marit looked at the grave, at the cabin, at the walls she had built with Soren's help. "What I promised," she said. "Teach, build, pass it forward. What else is there to do? The ground holds what we give it longer than we expect. Warmth in walls, memory in soil, knowledge in hands that will not stay still. Soren Eide had no children, no claim, no property to leave behind. But he left something worth more than any of those things, the understanding that survival is not a secret to be hoarded, but a skill to be shared. Marit stood at his grave until the cold drove her inside, and when she closed the door behind her, she did not feel alone. The walls remembered him. The notebook remembered him, and she would make sure the district remembered him too. The secondary crisis came in April. Marit was 3 weeks into the commission work, the walls of the Lindquist cabin slowly rising under her hands, when word reached her that something was wrong at the Muller claim. The Mullers were German immigrants, a family of 5 who had arrived in the territory the previous summer. They had built a soddy like Nora's, put in a winter crop, and survived the January cold through luck more than preparation. Their patriarch, Franz Miller, had been injured in a farming accident the previous autumn and had never fully recovered. Their matriarch, Greta, had managed the claim through the winter alone while caring for her husband and 3 children under the age of 10. Now Franz was dying. The infection that had started in his injured leg had spread despite Greta's desperate treatments. There was no doctor within 40 miles. There was no money for medicine, even if a doctor could be found. There was only a man in a bed, a fever that would not break, and a family facing the prospect of becoming widowed and fatherless on a claim they could not work alone. Marit heard the news from Nora, who heard it from a traveling peddler who had stopped at the Muller soddy and seen the desperation firsthand. "She needs help," Nora said. "Not just with the illness. There is nothing to be done about that, but with what comes after. If Franz dies, Greta will have to prove up the claim herself. She will have to maintain the soddy, work the fields, feed 3 children through another winter. She cannot do it alone. What can I do? Teach her. Help her. Do for her what you did for me." Marit thought about the commission, the money she needed, the work that was already behind schedule. She thought about her own son, her own claim, her own desperate calculations that never quite added up. Then she thought about Soren, about knowledge passing hand to hand, about survival as a skill to be shared rather than hoarded. "Where is the Miller claim?" she asked. Franz Miller died on the 12th of April. Marit was there when it happened. She had arrived 3 days earlier, leaving Ivor in Nora's care and walking the 11 miles to the Muller soddy with her notebook and her tools and a determination she was not sure she understood. She had found what the peddler described: a dying man, an exhausted woman, 3 children too young to understand what was happening. She could not save Franz. No one could save Franz. But she could do what Soren had taught her to do: share what she knew. In the 3 days before his death, she worked alongside Greta to reinforce the weakest sections of the soddy. She showed her the same techniques she had shown Nora: how to pack dry fill into gaps, how to brace against weight, how to create thermal barriers where different materials met. They worked in the early mornings and late evenings, when Franz was sleeping and the children were occupied, and Marit explained each step as they went. "This will not save your husband," she said bluntly on the first day. "I am not a doctor and I cannot cure what ails him, but it may save your children. It may save you. If the cold comes again and you are alone here, these walls will give you a chance." Greta had stared at her with eyes that held grief and terror and something else, something that looked like desperate hope. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You do not know me. I have nothing to pay you." "Because someone helped me when I had nothing to pay. Because knowledge dies if it is not shared. Because my son is alive today because I learned what I am teaching you, and your children deserve the same chance." They worked. They did not talk about Franz, about death, about the terrible days ahead. They talked about bracing and fill depth and the importance of keeping moisture away from packed materials. They talked about survival. When Franz died, Marit helped Greta wash the body and wrap it for burial. She dug the grave alongside the eldest child, a boy of 9 who worked without complaint and cried without shame. She stood beside the family as they said their prayers, and she did not leave until the mound was complete. "What do I do now?" Greta asked when the others had gone inside. "You survive," Marit said. "You work the claim. You raise your children. You prepare for next winter. You do what has to be done." "I do not know if I can." "I did not know if I could either. But I am still here." Marit put her hand on Greta's shoulder. "You are not alone. The district knows you now. People will help. I will help. But you have to keep going. That is the only rule that matters." Greta looked at the fresh grave, at the soddy, at the 3 children watching from the doorway. "I will keep going," she said. "If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it." Caleb Dorr came to the Mueller claim 2 days later. Marit was still there, helping Greta organize the spring planting. When she saw his wagon approaching from the direction of De Smet, she recognized his posture before she could make out his face, the way he sat, the way he held the reins, the particular combination of confidence and contempt that seemed to radiate from him even at a distance. "Stay inside," she told Greta. "Let me handle this." She met Dorr in the yard, her arms crossed, her expression neutral. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her anger. "Widow Vangen." He climbed down from the wagon and looked around at the soddy, the fresh grave, the signs of recent work. "I heard you were here, playing nurse to the German family. I was helping them prepare for next winter." "Ah, yes, the walls." His lip curled. "Teaching more people your dirt house method, I suppose." "Teaching them how to survive." "Teaching them how to become dependent on you, you mean?" Dorr walked closer, lowering his voice. "Do you think I do not see what you are doing? You have made yourself indispensable, the widow who knows the secret, the woman everyone needs. You are building power, Vangen, influence, a position you did not earn and do not deserve. I am building walls, nothing more. You are undermining my business." His voice hardened. "Every family that copies your method is a family that burns less fuel. Every cabin that holds heat through the night is a cabin that does not need emergency resupply. You are costing me money, Widow Vangen, real money, and I do not intend to allow it." Marit felt her jaw tighten. "What do you intend to do? Forbid people from building better houses?" "I intend to make sure people understand the risks. Your walls are untested. One winter does not prove anything. When those sand-filled cavities settle and crack, when the moisture gets in and the wood rots, when the whole structure collapses on the families inside, I will make sure everyone knows who is responsible. The walls have held through the worst cold in 8 years. So far." Dorr smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. "But winters are long on the prairie, Widow Vangen, and reputations are fragile things. Enjoy your influence while it lasts." He climbed back onto his wagon and drove away. Marit watched him go, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from rage. Dorr was not just threatening her. He was threatening everyone she had taught, everyone who had trusted her method, everyone who had survived the January cold because of walls she had helped them build. She would not let him win. The work continued through April and into May. Marit finished the Lindquist Commission and accepted 2 more, both families who had heard about her walls and wanted the same protection for their own cabins. She charged what she needed to survive and taught freely to anyone who could not pay. She trained Nora to do basic installations, creating a helper she could call on when the work exceeded her own capacity. The district was changing. Where there had been flimsy board cabins and drafty soddies, there were now reinforced walls, filled cavities, structures that had been built or modified using the principles Marit had learned from Soren. Not everyone adopted the method. Some still trusted Door's warnings. Some could not afford the materials. Some simply preferred to do things the way they had always been done. But enough people had changed that the landscape of survival had shifted. Fewer families would freeze next winter. Fewer children would die in their beds because the stove went out at midnight. Fewer graves would be dug in frozen ground because a cabin could not hold the heat. That was what Soren had wanted. That was what Marit had promised. She thought about him often as she worked, his patient corrections, his careful diagrams, his insistence that knowledge should outlive the person who carried it. She thought about Björn Helland, the lime burner he had learned from, and the chain of teaching that extended backward into time. She thought about the chain extending forward through her, through Nora, through everyone who learned the method and passed it on. Heat is patient, Soren had said. It does not rush. It does not skip steps. Neither did knowledge. Neither did survival. Neither did the slow, steady work of building something that would last. By the end of May, Marit had taught more than 20 people. She kept a list in the back of the notebook, names, claims, what they had learned, what they had built. The list grew longer each week as word spread and more people came asking for help. Some she taught in their own cabins. Some came to her claim and worked beside her, learning the way she had learned from Soren. Some simply took the notebook pages and figured it out themselves, returning only when they had questions she could answer. The hostile skeptic's voice grew quieter. Dor still talked, still warned, still predicted disaster. But his predictions were not coming true. The spring thaw had come and gone, and the walls had not collapsed. The moisture had not rotted the wood. The sand had not settled enough to create the gaps he had promised. The method was proving itself season by season, and there was nothing Dor could do to stop it. He tried other tactics. He spread rumors that Marit was charging too much, that she was refusing to help people who could not pay, that she was hoarding knowledge for her own profit. None of it stuck. The people she had taught for free spoke louder than his lies. The families she had helped without payment defended her to anyone who would listen. The arithmetic of reputation was turning against him. And unlike fuel or money, reputation could not be bought at his lumberyard. Summer came early that year, a dry, hot June that baked the prairie grass brown and made everyone worry about fire. Marit worked through the heat, finishing commissions, teaching new students, maintaining her own cabin's walls against the settling and cracking that Soren had warned her about. Ivar grew taller and healthier. His cough had vanished with the spring, replaced by the boundless energy of a 7-year-old who had survived his first frontier winter and emerged stronger for it. He helped with the work now, carrying sand, holding boards, learning the techniques his mother had mastered. He would not remember Soren clearly, Marit knew. But he would remember what Soren had taught, because Marit would make sure he did. The claim was proving up. 2.5 years of residence completed, 2.5 more to go. The improvements were visible and documented, the doubled walls, the reinforced roof, the small additions she had made throughout the spring. When the 5 years were done, the land would be hers legally and permanently. No one would be able to take it from her. No one would be able to take what she had built. She stood in the yard one evening in late June, watching the sun set over the prairie, and allowed herself something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, the kind that grips you when you are counting fuel and praying for spring, but the quieter hope of continuation. The sense that what she had built would last, that what she had taught would spread, that the life she was making for herself and her son would hold steady through whatever came next. She did not know what the next winter would bring. She did not know if Dor would find new ways to undermine her. She did not know if the walls she had helped others build would hold as well as her own. But she knew one thing with certainty. She was not the same woman who had buried her husband in October. She had been transformed by the work, by the teaching, by the simple act of surviving when everyone said she could not. The widow who could not cut firewood had become something else entirely, and the district was beginning to understand what that something was. Chunk 4 continues. The second winter came, and with it came the proof that Marit had been waiting for. The cold arrived in December, not the killing cold of the previous January, but a sustained grinding freeze that tested every cabin in the district for weeks without relief. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there. The wind found every gap and punished every weakness. The fuel stack shrank, and the nights grew long, and the prairie became once again what it had always been, a place that did not forgive mistakes. The cabins Marit had built held. The cabins Marit had taught others to build held. The cabins that had been reinforced using her methods, modified using her principles, packed and braced and capped according to the diagrams in Soren's notebook. They held heat through the night, kept frost off the inner walls, allowed families to sleep without fear that they would not wake. And the cabins that had not been modified, the single-board shacks and drafty shelters that Dorr had assured people were adequate, they failed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow accumulation of suffering that came from nights that were slightly too cold, mornings that were slightly too hard, fuel that ran out slightly too fast. No one died that winter. That was the miracle, if miracle was the right word. But plenty of people suffered, and when the thaw came, they knew who to blame for their suffering and who to thank for their survival. Dorr's influence cracked like ice in spring runoff. The confrontation came in February, on a day when the temperature had climbed just high enough to make travel possible. Marit was in Desmet, buying supplies at the general store, when Dorr found her. He looked diminished, thinner than she remembered, his face drawn with something that might have been stress or illness, or simply the weight of a winter that had not gone his way. His storehouse had lost business. His fuel sales had dropped. His predictions of collapse had been proven wrong in front of the entire district. Widow Vangen, his voice was flat, stripped of the confidence she had come to expect. I need to speak with you. Then speak. He glanced around the store. Several people were watching, customers who had heard the rumors, who knew the history between them, who were waiting to see what would happen. Not here, outside. Marit considered refusing, considered making him say whatever he had to say in front of witnesses who would spread the story across the district by nightfall. But something in his expression, a weariness she had not seen before, made her nod. They walked outside into the cold, gray afternoon. Dorr led her around the corner of the building, out of sight of the windows, and stopped with his back against the wall. My sister is sick, he said. Marit waited. She has been sick since Christmas. The cold her room is in the back of my house, the coldest part, and I could not keep it warm enough. The stove could not keep up with what the walls lost. He would not meet her eyes. She is getting worse. The doctor says she needs warmth, constant warmth, or her lungs will fail. I am sorry to hear that. I need your help. The words hung in the air between them. Marit let them hang. She did not rush to fill the silence, did not offer comfort or solutions. She simply waited for him to say what he needed to say. I need you to reinforce one room, Dorr continued. Just the room where she sleeps. Pack the walls, brace the cavity, do whatever it is you do. I will pay you. Whatever you ask. Whatever I ask. Within reason, but yes, whatever is reasonable. Marit looked at him, this man who had mocked her, threatened her, tried to take her claim and undermine her reputation. This man who had told everyone that her walls were a trick, that the sand would settle and the wood would rot and the whole method would fail. This man who had said, in front of witnesses, that earth was for graves. "Why should I help you?" she asked. "Because my sister is dying." His voice cracked. "Because I was wrong. Because I have spent the last year trying to destroy something that works, and now I need it to save someone I love." "You tried to take my home." "Yes." "You spread lies about my method." "Yes." "You told people I was building graves." Dorr flinched. "Yes, I said that. I was wrong." "You were not wrong because you believed it. You were wrong because you wanted me to fail. You wanted everyone who listened to me to fail, because their success cost you money." "I know." He looked at her finally, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "I know what I did. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to help my sister. She did nothing wrong. She does not deserve to suffer because I was cruel." Marit thought about Soren, about knowledge passing hand to hand, about survival as a skill to be shared rather than hoarded. She thought about the list in her notebook, more than 20 names now, more than 20 families who had learned the method and passed it forward. She thought about Franz Meller's widow, about the Halberd girls who had survived that terrible night, about Elias Rourke pressing his palm against her wall and admitting he was wrong. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who helped, even when helping was hard. "I will reinforce your sister's room," she said. "I will do it this week before the next cold snap, and I will not charge you." Dorr stared at her. "Why?" "Because the knowledge was never mine to sell. Because your sister deserves warmth the same as anyone else. Because I will not become the person you wanted me to be, someone who hoards power and punishes enemies." She met his eyes. "But I want you to understand something, Mr. Dorr. I am not doing this for you. I am doing this because it is the right thing to do. And when your sister is well, you will tell everyone what happened. You will tell them that the method works. You will tell them that you were wrong. I will. You will stop spreading lies about the walls. I will. And if I ever hear that you are trying to undermine my work again, I will make sure the entire district knows that you came to me on your knees begging for help. Do you understand?" Dorr nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good." Marit turned to walk away, then stopped. "Your sister, what is her name?" "Ingeborg. Ingeborg Dorr. I will be there tomorrow morning. Have the room cleared and the materials ready. I will bring my own tools." She walked back into the store without looking back. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the effort of being merciful when every part of her had wanted to refuse. But mercy was what Soren would have wanted. Mercy was what the method demanded. Knowledge did not care who received it. Warmth did not care whose walls held it in. She would save Dorr's sister, and in doing so, she would prove something more important than any argument could have proven, that the walls worked, that the method was sound, that even her greatest enemy could not deny the truth when it was his family's survival at stake. She finished the work in 3 days. Dorr's house was larger than hers, a proper frame structure with multiple rooms, built in the early days of De Smet's growth, but the construction was shoddy, the walls thin, the gaps numerous. The room where Ingeborg slept was the coldest corner of the building, far from the main stove, exposed to north wind on 2 sides. Marit reinforced both exterior walls. She built the frames, installed the bracing, packed the cavities with sand. She had Dorr haul from the same creek bend where she had gathered her own fill 2 winters before. She worked from dawn to dark while Ingeborg watched from her bed, a thin woman in her 50s with a persistent cough and eyes that held gratitude she could not quite express. Thank you," Ingeborg said on the 3rd day, as Marit was capping the final cavity. "My brother told me what you were doing, what it cost you to agree. It cost me nothing but time. That is not true. It cost you the satisfaction of refusing. That is harder to give up than money. Marit smiled despite herself. Your brother said something like that once, about me choosing pride over sense. My brother says many things. Not all of them are wise. Ingeborg coughed, a rattling sound that made Marit wince. But he was wrong about you. I told him so last winter when I heard what you had built. I told him he should be learning from you instead of fighting you. He did not listen. Men rarely listen to their sisters, but they learn eventually. Ingeborg reached out and touched the newly capped wall. This is good work. I can feel the difference already. The difference will be greater when the sand has time to absorb heat. Give it a few days of steady fire, and the wall will start holding temperature overnight. Will it save me? Marit paused. It was not a question she could answer with certainty. It will give you a better chance, she said finally. Warmth alone cannot cure sickness, but cold makes everything worse. If we can keep you warm through February and March, your body will have the strength to heal. Ingeborg nodded slowly. That is all anyone can ask. A chance. Ingeborg Dorr survived the winter. By April, her cough had diminished. By May, she was walking in the yard, taking in the spring air, gaining back the weight she had lost during the cold months. The reinforced room had held heat through the worst of February's freeze, keeping her warm while she slept, giving her body the consistent temperature it needed to fight off the infection in her lungs. Caleb Dorr kept his word. He did not apologize publicly. That was not in his nature, but he stopped spreading rumors about the walls. He stopped predicting collapse. He stopped warning people away from the method. And when customers asked him about the Van Gen technique, he told them the truth, that it worked, that his own sister was alive because of it, that anyone who wanted to learn should talk to the widow on the claim 17 miles east. It was not friendship. Marit did not expect friendship, did not want it. But it was an end to the war that had consumed so much of her energy for 2 winters. She could work now without watching for Dorr's next attack. She could teach without worrying that her students would hear lies before they heard truth. The hostile skeptic had been neutralized, not through defeat, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that could not be denied. Anders Lund came to the claim in June of 1885. He was a blacksmith from Brookings, 43 years old, widowed 2 years prior when his wife had died in childbirth, along with the daughter who would have been their first child. He had heard about the sand wall cabins from a freight driver who had seen one being built, and he had traveled 60 miles to see the method for himself. Marit met him in the yard, expecting another student, another person who wanted to learn the technique and apply it to their own situation. What she got was something different. I am not here to learn how to fill walls, Anders said. He was a solid man, broad-shouldered, with hands that showed decades of forge work and eyes that held a directness she found both unsettling and refreshing. I'm here because I heard you need better stove shielding. The sheet metal collars you use around the pipe. They work, but they could work better. I can fabricate something that will last longer and protect more thoroughly. How do you know what collars I use? The freight driver described them. He said they were made from tinsmith scraps, bent by hand, held with wire loops. Good enough for emergency work, but not meant for permanent installation. Marit felt her face flush. The collars were exactly as he described, improvised, temporary, adequate, but not elegant. She had meant to replace them with something better, but she had never had the time or the expertise. I cannot afford to pay for custom metalwork, she said. I did not ask for payment. Anders looked at the cabin, at the doubled walls, at the construction that had saved her life and changed the district. I'm looking for work that matters. Forge work pays the bills, but it does not feed the soul. I have spent 2 years making horseshoes and barrel hoops and hinges. I would like to make something that keeps people alive. And you think stove shielding qualifies? I think anything that prevents a house from burning down qualifies. Anything that makes your walls safer and more reliable. Anything that helps the method spread to places where tinsmith scraps are not available. Marit studied him. He was not handsome in the conventional sense. His face was too weathered, his build too heavy, but there was something in his manner that she found appealing, a practicality, a willingness to see a problem and offer a solution without being asked. "Show me what you have in mind," she said. He stayed for 3 days fabricating prototypes. The collars he designed were made from heavier gauge metal with flanged edges that locked together instead of requiring wire binding. They fit more snugly around the stovepipe, created more consistent air gaps, and could be installed or removed without tools. He also designed a heat shield for the stove itself, a curved panel that deflected radiant heat toward the wall cavity instead of letting it dissipate into the room. "If the wall is meant to absorb heat," he explained, "then we should help it absorb heat. This shield will direct more warmth toward the packed section, which means faster charging during the day and more stored heat for the night." "You thought of this yourself?" "I thought about the problem you're trying to solve. The rest followed." They worked together through the 3 days, Anders at his portable forge, Marit explaining the wall construction and the principles behind it. He asked intelligent questions, made useful suggestions, and never once treated her knowledge as inferior because she was a woman. He spoke to her the way Soren had spoken to her, as a colleague, a collaborator, someone whose expertise he respected. On the 3rd evening, he asked if he could return. "There's more work to be done," he said. "Better ventilation systems, improved damper designs, ways to distribute heat more evenly through a room instead of concentrating it near the stove. I have ideas, but I need to understand the walls better before I can implement them." "You would come back for that? 60 miles? "I would come back for work that matters, and this matters." He paused. "It also does not hurt that the company is agreeable." Marit felt herself blush again. She was 30 years old, a widow with a child, a woman who had spent 2 years fighting for survival. She had not thought about companionship, about partnership, about the possibility that someone might see her as more than a teacher or a threat. "The company is agreeable," she said carefully, "when you return." He smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, unguarded, warm, the expression of a man who had found something he had not expected to find. "I will return in 2 weeks," he said, with more metal and more ideas. "I will be here." He left the next morning, and Marit stood in the yard watching his wagon disappear over the horizon the same way she had watched so many others leave. But this time, for the first time, she found herself hoping that the leaving was temporary. Anders Lunde returned in 2 weeks, as promised. He returned again in August and September and October. Each visit brought new designs, new improvements, new solutions to problems Marit had not known she had. He fabricated a complete set of heat shields for her cabin, then taught her how to explain their purpose so she could recommend them to others. He designed a modular bracing system that made wall construction faster and more consistent. He created a sand-drying rack that doubled the capacity of her original design. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, they fell in love. It happened slowly, the way heat moves through mass, not in a rush, but in a steady accumulation that built until it could not be ignored. They talked during the work, about their lives and their losses and their hopes for the future. They shared meals at her table, with Ivor chattering between them about the things 7-year-olds find important. They walked the claim in the evenings, watching the sun set over the prairie grass, and gradually the distance between them shrank until there was no distance left. He proposed in November, on the anniversary of the night the Halberd girls had arrived at her door. "I'm not asking you to give up anything," he said. "I am asking you to let me help you build what you have already started. The walls, the teaching, the life you're making here. I want to be part of it. I want Ivor to have a father again. I want you to have a partner who understands what you have done and what it cost you." Marit did not answer immediately. She looked at the walls she had built, at the cabin that had saved her life, at the son who was watching from the doorway with eyes that held hope he was trying to hide. "Yes," she said. They married in December in a small ceremony at the church in De Smet. Nora Halberd stood as witness. Elias Rourke attended, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes, but present nonetheless. Even Greta Muller came, with her 3 children, to see the woman who had helped her survive become a wife again. Caleb Dorr did not attend, but he sent a gift, a set of fine brass hinges for the cabin door, with a note that said simply, "For the house that held." It was as close to blessing as he would ever give. The years that followed were years of building. Anders moved his forge to the claim, setting up a workshop in a new structure they built together. Doubled walls, packed cavities, the same method that had started everything. He continued his metalwork, fabricating stove shields and collars and ventilation systems that made the sand wall cabins safer and more efficient. Marit continued teaching, traveling to claims across the district and beyond, spreading the knowledge that Soren had passed to her. Ivar grew into a young man who knew the method as well as his mother did. By the time he was 12, he could build a wall frame from scratch. By 15, he was helping with commissions, working alongside Marit and Anders to reinforce cabins throughout the territory. He would inherit the knowledge, and he would pass it forward, and the chain that had started with a lime burner named Björn Helland would continue unbroken. They had 2 more children, a daughter in 87 and a son in 89. The cabin grew to accommodate them. New rooms added with the same careful construction, the same packed walls, the same attention to the movement of heat. What had started as a desperate gamble became a home, a workshop, a school for anyone who wanted to learn. The claim proved up in 1888, 5 years after Ole Vangen had filed the original papers. The land was Marit's, legally and permanently, and she celebrated by planting a row of cottonwood saplings along the eastern edge, the direction the worst winter winds came from, the direction she had faced down so many times. She planted 1 tree for Ole, who had started everything. She planted 1 tree for Soren, who had taught her how to finish it, and she planted 1 tree for herself, because she had earned the right to be remembered. Marit Vangen Lunde lived to see the new century. She watched the territory become a state, the rail lines spread across the prairie, the small claims grow into farms, and the farms grow into towns. She watched the method she had pioneered become standard practice throughout the region, not because she had patented it or profited from it, but because she had taught it freely to anyone who asked, and they had taught it to others, and the knowledge had spread like warmth through mass, slowly and steadily, and in every direction at once. She buried Anders in 1904, after his heart gave out during a summer heat wave. She buried Ivor in 1912, after a farming accident that echoed his father's death too closely to be borne without tears. She buried friends and neighbors and former students, the inevitable toll of time on a generation that had carved a life from nothing. She never stopped teaching. Even in her 70s, when her hands shook too badly to drive nails and her back would not let her climb ladders, she sat with young builders and explained the principles. Dense materials answer slow. Heat is patient. The walls must remember what the stove has given them. She said these things until they became rote, until they passed from her lips to other ears to other hands, until the knowledge existed independently of the woman who had discovered it. She died in the winter of 1918, in the same room where she had survived the killing cold 35 years before. She died with her daughter at her side and her grandson holding her hand and the walls still warm around her. The walls she had built with sand and desperation, and the memory of her father's voice saying thick ground answers slow. She died in bed, not frozen, not stiff, not found by strangers in the spring thaw. She died having proven Elias Rourke wrong in every way that mattered. By the winter of 1884, when the worst cold in 8 years descended on the Dakota prairie, Marit Vangen had taught 31 people the method that would save their lives. 31 families who packed their walls with river sand, who braced their cavities and capped their fill, and created houses that remembered warmth the way the earth remembered summer. 31 families who survived that January because a widow with $29 and a 6-year-old son had refused to die the way everyone expected. Those 31 taught others, and those others taught more. And by the time the century turned, the principle had spread across 3 states and into territories beyond, not as a patent or a product, but as knowledge passed hand to hand. The way Soren had learned from Björn and Marit had learned from Soren, and everyone who came after learned from everyone who came before. Marit Vangen Lunde spent her final years on the same claim where she had buried her first husband, in a cabin that had grown from 12 feet by 14 to a sprawling homestead with a forge and a workshop and a schoolroom where she taught the children of former students. She never left. She never wanted to. The land was hers, and the walls were hers, and the life she had made was worth more than any other place could offer. She died with winter light falling across the quilt her mother had sewn 50 years before, with the stove burning low and the walls still giving back the heat they had stored. The temperature outside was 22 below zero. The temperature in her room was warm enough that her daughter did not need to add wood until an hour after she was gone. Elias Rourke had stood in her doorway 35 years earlier and said, "If you bank on that contraption, widow, they will find you and the boy stiff before thaw." On the morning they found her, Marit's hands were soft. Her face was peaceful. The walls around her held their warmth like a promise kept, and the frost on the window went no farther than the glass. She had not won by making more fire. She had won by teaching a house to remember it, and the house remembered still.